Welcome to MoleMash. Today we're going to be building an application that introduces you to some of the imaging and animation capabilities within App Inventor. We're going to be teaching you how to use image sprites, a timer, and then how to implement those into a short little game. Okay, first we need to build the objects that we need for this particular application. So first, since we're building an environment where we're going to be drawing images onto the screen, we'll first need a canvas. So we'll drag the canvas out onto the screen, and then I'm going to have to size it. So I'm just going to say fill the parent by the width, and the height I'll go ahead and, as I normally do, I'll just make it 300 pixels because that gives us some space at the bottom to work with to put some buttons that we're going to need. We're going to also now put a label. The label is going to be used for the score in our game, so I'm going to rename this to score label. And I'll change the text of it to score. And then we'll add a button. The button will be used to reset the game. So let's rename it to reset button. And change the text on this to reset. Okay, so we place those on. Now the next thing we're going to add in is going to be an object that's not visible, and this is going to be the timer. The timer is going to be used in this particular game to place the mole in different places around the screen at distinct intervals. So what we need to do this is a sensor object, and the sensor object is the clock. There's a clock built into every Android tablet or phone, and we're going to borrow some of its capabilities for this application. If you come over here where it says clock 1, there's some options here. It says timer always fires. What this means is that the timer is going to go off continuously whenever the timer interval is up. This means it's actually turned on so that it will work. And this is the interval in milliseconds. In this particular case says after 1000 milliseconds, the timer will go off. What this means is that every 1 second, our timer will go off. So if we leave it at this particular time frame, we can assume that our mole, which we will place on the screen here shortly, will move to a different location on the screen every second. That's fairly quick, so I'm going to move this back to 3000 milliseconds so it doesn't move quite as fast. Okay, the next object that we want to place on here is the mole itself. So I'm going to pull an image sprite out onto our canvas, and then I'm going to upload the file. Now I've already downloaded the mole picture off of the MoleMash page. So if you haven't done that, you'll need to do that first. So I'm just going to go find the mole picture. I believe I put it on my desktop. It's normally where I put these things. There it is. So I'm going to upload that into my media. And then for the image sprite, I'll choose the mole as the picture. Now the rest of these options here, I'm just going to leave standard. I don't need to change those at this moment. Okay, now we should be ready to move on to the actual coding part. So that's where we'll go next. Okay, here we are at the coding screen. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start off by putting a variable on the screen. We want to keep track of a score. The score will be when we touch the mole, it will add 1 to our score. So we'll just create a variable here, call it score, and we'll set its initial value to 0. Okay, so then let's move on and let's go to the image sprite. I should have renamed this back on the designer side, but I forgot that. So in the future it's better to name these correctly so you don't lose track of what you're working with. So what I'll do is I'll pull this out here, and then I'll go back and let me rename this image sprite to the correct area. So I'm going to call this the mole sprite, and then go back over to the coding so that it's a lot easier for me to understand what I'm working with. So I pulled the wrong one out here. I didn't want to collide with. I want a mole sprite touched. So let me grab that. So when we touch the mole sprite, there's a couple of things we're going to want to do here. The first thing is we're going to want to add to the score. So I'm going to grab out a set variable, change this to global score, and we want to increase this. So I'll grab a math block, and we're wanting to increase the global score by 1. So at first I'll get that current score, and then I'll add 1 to it. So this, when we touch the mole, it should add 1 to the score. So the next thing we would want to do is we would want to actually move the mole to a new spot on the screen. So I'm going to put together here some code for the X position of the mole, and then we'll just duplicate that. It'll be easy to do this for the Y portion. So let's go to the mole itself. Let's go to one of its set capabilities here. So we want to set the X position of the mole, and we want to put this somewhere on the screen. So the key here is, where on the screen do we want to put it? The screen itself, if I go back to the designer here, the width is the X side, so it has a width of, well, we're not quite sure here because it's set to automatic. Well, in most programming languages, you can utilize information from the program itself to provide you with this information. So one thing I could do here is I want to place it somewhere on the X axis, so I could use one of these random functions that we've done in the past. Here I could say place it anywhere on the 1, 2, but we don't know what the width is. But we can find that out by going to the canvas. And then in the canvas area, I can actually find the width of the canvas here. So if I were to run this game right now, the mole, once it's touched, would move to a random X position somewhere between the value 1 to the width of the canvas. Now there are some small issues with this. If we did run this, you'd notice that this mole here might end up here, but he also might end up completely off the screen over here. And that's because this spot right here on the mole is known as its origin. That's the 0, 0 position. So if I were to set the X position at 0, or in this case we had it our set to 1, it would place it at the 1 location on the X-axis. If I said set it to the screen width, it would set it outside of the screen. So we have to somehow take care of that. And a way to do that is to ensure that you don't allow this to be larger than the width of the mole itself. So what we could do here is find out what the width of the mole is, which is this object here. And what I'd want to do is take the canvas size and subtract out the width of the mole so that the mole won't end up outside of the right side of the canvas. So I'm going to need a math function here. I'm going to need a subtraction. So let me grab a subtraction here, place that in here, and place these two up in here. Now you will notice, if you're following along in the instruction sheet, that this is a little different than what they're explaining you to do in that, but this will work the same. I'm just showing you that there are more than one ways to complete these tasks. Alright, so now I'll set up a Y component. So let me place that, and I'm just going to change the values here. Y, instead of width, we're going to want height, and instead of width here, we'll want height. So now it's set up that when the mole is touched, the score will increase and the mole will move. But we also need one more thing, and that is we need to change the label here to reflect the correct score. So let's go back to our blocks, and let's go to the score label here, and we're going to do a set here, set score label text to. We're going to need a join command here and a text block. So let me grab the join, and we're going to need to duplicate this because we're going to join it to the word score. Okay, now this is enough to get the game somewhat up and running, because this will, if I were to start it right now, let me give this a try. Okay, here on the emulator, I'm doing this a little different than we've done in the past. We can see that I have a picture of the mole on the screen. Now I'm going to touch it on my here, and you'll notice in just a second here, this takes a little bit for it to update, that it will move on the screen and the score will update. So I'll touch it again and you should see the score update again. Okay, now this will only work if you touch it. It isn't actually moving on its own, so we need to add that capability. Okay, so now we need to add the timer. So the way the timer works, we'll go to the clock, and there is this when action called when the timer. When the timer goes off, and as I said here before, if we go back to the designer, that the clock is set up to go off every 3,000 milliseconds or every 3 seconds. So every 3 seconds that this code is going to run. And what we want to do with this code is just move the mole sprite. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate these two sets of code and put them into the timer. And now the mole should move on its own without me having to actually accomplish anything. I don't even have to touch the screen now, and the mole will move. And let's do one last item here. Let's set up the reset button while we're at it. So when the reset button is touched, we are going to want to set the global score. I'm going to duplicate this back to 0. So I can pull this piece off, pull this piece out, and make that 0. So we're resetting the score. Oops. And we also need to reset the label. So I can duplicate this and place it down here. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's give this a try again. Okay, now we should see the mole is actually moving on its own. I'm not tapping the screen and there is no score being shown here. Now if I do tap it, I should see the score increase, and then the mole will move immediately after I tap it. You can't really see that on the screen here, but that's what's happening. Okay. Okay, so this is a fully functioning app at this point, but there's one more. What I'd like to talk about next is the small problem that we have with the code that we're using right now. You notice that we duplicated in 2 different places sets of code. So I moved and duplicated the mole sprite movement to the clock timer, and I duplicated the score update in 2 places as well. This is a perfect opportunity to use something called a user procedure. These are designed to place code that's used in more than one place in one location that you can then refer to. This makes it easier in the event I want to make some change, for instance, to the label. If I wanted to change this from score to maybe moles smashed, I would have to change it in this case in 2 places. By using a user procedure, I would only have to do it in 1 place. So we're going to set up 2 user procedures, and you do that by the procedure control. Here we're going to use this top one. It's the to procedure do, and here in the procedure area you type in a name that makes sense to you. In this case, the first one we're going to create is the move mole procedure, and the move mole procedure is really these 2 sets of commands here that move the mole to a new location. And in their place, I need to put a call to this procedure. So I go back to the procedures and a new item has appeared here, the call command. What this does is that when the do command here finishes this command, it'll move here, and this says, I need to go to someplace else in the code, and it goes, this is the place. It goes and finds it, and then it executes these commands. When it's done here, it'll come back and then execute the next command. Okay, so this particular move mole command needs to be in 2 places. It's here in the clock timer. We don't need that anymore as well. So let me put this in the trash can. And of course it doesn't like to delete lots of stuff. Okay, so that's one procedure. Now there's another procedure we can make as well, and that's for updating the score. So I'll just create another procedure here, and I'm just going to call this update score. And I'm going to take this particular item here, it's the same as this, and then I'm going to go back to procedures, grab the call update score, and we'll put it in the 2 places where we had the score being updated before. Okay, let me put that over here. Okay, so this code that we have here will do exactly the same thing that the previous code did. Let me go ahead and show you that. Let's bring up the program. So the program should be working the same. If I press the reset button, we should notice that the score goes back to 0. If I touch a a mole, the score should go to 1 and the mole should continue working around the screen. So really, in terms of an application, we haven't changed the way the application works, but we've changed the programming to make it easier for us in the future if we have to make changes to this program. The procedure command is one of the more important commands that you can learn in programming. Okay, that is it for MoleMash.